Hello everyone and nice to meet you for another video of Ethan's Culture Box. Now today we want to of course talk about something different than the past two videos. The past two videos we talked about German and Korean education systems and how these things shape the characteristics and traits of the individuals, many of the individuals in these countries. Also, we could derive a conclusion that through these education systems, South Korea are really good at developing and really, let's say, educating the optimal scholars and students, whereas Germany produces lots of great thinkers and philosophical minds that thinks in a very deep level, besides academics. So today we want to talk about a little deeper and a little more analytical topic. Today we want to talk about a paradox that I have spotted and that many people in the fields of sociology has spotted. And today we're going to talk about a topic that is related with economy, individual and community behaviors, and we want to provide some explanations for the paradox or for the societal phenomenon that I have spotted, and we want to also kind of talk about the effects that it might have in these two different cultures and communities, and also derive a conclusion on what we can learn and what we can take away from this paradox that we're going to discuss. So let's just dive right into it. Now, I want to start this discussion by stating a common consensus that many people know already about Korea and Germany. Now, first talking about Korea, we all know that Korean people are mostly and very frequently very humble. Now, that means that people are tending to lower themselves down, even in situations where they are actually not inferior, even in situations where they might have let's say, an exceptional skill or talent at a certain field. People tend to become more modest and humble, especially in the Korean nation. And well, an evidence for that could be, just look at Sun. Anyways, now talking about a more sociological reasoning for why Koreans may be a little more humble than people from other cultures and countries, and well, not only Koreans but many East Asians. So I think possibly one reason is because we basically learn from the views and perspectives of the elders, and we have a certain culture that people respect the elderlies a lot, greatly. Of course, many other countries would do that as well. Most of the cultures would respect and have a certain degree of, let's say, trust and respect and let's say a loyalty to the elders and to the past generations. But South Korea has that even in a more deeper level. South Korea really does what the elders think is right, and that is not only in an individual level, it is in the cultural level. So it is embedded in the culture already that the things that are perceived as virtuous, as something ethical, as something that really exemplifies a great person and a great personality is done and practiced and trained for the next generations as well. And humbleness is just something that is also viewed as something virtuous, something really really honorable from the past generations, which is the reason why the generations that we have currently are also trained in the same, let's say, category or same perspective. And secondly, I would even argue that the Korean language is something that enables this and pushes the humbleness of Koreans to a whole another level. And that is because, as some of you guys would know, South Korean language has different types of formalities. Now, what that means is that in certain cases, when you talk with friends, you use almost a whole another language, whole another vocabulary, and let's say grammatical attributes and features that you wouldn't use when you would talk to an elderly, or when you would talk to a person that is, let's say, older than you or have more experiences than you. Now, that is why the language, basically, the difference of language that you use in friend contexts and in places where you have to kind of lower yourself down, is what makes you, or makes South Koreans, let's say, capable of being ultra humble. Because without the language, obviously, let's take English as an example. Without English having an extra formal tone, it would be, of course, a little challenging for people to become really, really humble just by saying and just by talking, just by having a conversation. There will be other ways, other gestures, other, let's say, actions that one would take to look humble, but solely based on the language, there might be a certain barrier in achieving a greater level of humbleness. Now, South Korean language enables that already. So I think that's why South Korea has this humbleness that is very prevalent and that is very pervasively spread. However, there are many studies and experiments shown that these humbleness that is perceived as something good in many different cultures besides South Korea acts as something very negative, something that kind of, let's say, limits South Korean talents in a greater, let's say, field and greater communities, including the Western cultures. And the reason for that is because some people tend to be humble in situations where they actually kind of have to reduce their humbleness and show more of their true talents and abilities. For example, in an interview, in a job interview, there is two different people. There's person A, who is South Korean, very humble, very talented. There's person B, who also applied for the same job, for the same role. They're now in a competition, but that guy is a totally Western guy. And he has, indeed, some extent of humbleness, but he is really capable of expressing his strengths and articulating his capabilities and his, let's say, possible actions that he could take for the role and for the company that he's applying to. Now, in these cases, many, let's say, experiments, examples, videos, social tests has shown that, let's say, oftentimes, South Korean people tend to lower themselves down in these cases as well. Now, what that leads to is these people, person A, who comes from a South Korean background, will have a lower chance in going into the company and getting the job offer, because he really couldn't have the ability to express himself, and he was viewed as not confident enough. So that's why it's, of course, good to have a certain balance. It's good to have some mixtures between different cultures, because as we already know, being ultra, let's say, hard and very leaning towards something to a great extent is not something that you really would want to do. Now, transitioning back to Germany, for German culture, it's quite the opposite of South Korea. And the reason why it's the opposite is because German people are, of course, there might be some people who are humble, but what I want to emphasize is German people have the capability and ability, more frequently than in Korea, to express their strengths and to be really confident in front of the crowd, especially when it comes to talking about their own individual capabilities and aspects of themselves. Now, I think that I have personally experienced this in real life as well in my 6.5 years journey and life in Germany. um, because this trait is exhibited and trained and, let's say, tailored from an age that people would go to school. So, for example, at my old school in gymnasium, I would see many friends raising up their hands when a teacher asks a question to, let's say, express their thoughts and articulate their vision, their perspective and knowledge on a certain problem-solving scenario, or a certain exercise, or a certain, let's say, experiment when it comes to science or chemistry classes, right? So that's something different compared to South Korea, where, as many of you guys can really see in, let's say, many real-life videos and classroom footages, people tend to raise their hands less, and if you raise your hands too often, then you're kind of considered as a little peculiar, a little, let's say, kind of show off. It might not be the case for every single scenarios and situations. There are cases where you would benefit from those things individually, but still, I'm talking about a general consensus that, of course, might have certain biases into it. But as a person who would analyze cultures, it is necessary to, let's say, pinpoint these kind of differences and aspects in general. So yeah, in conclusion, Germany are more bold, confident, and maybe a little less humble than South Koreans in most of the domains and conversations. However, here comes the paradox. Things change drastically if South Koreans talk about money. If it comes to money, if it comes to capitalistic topics, if it comes to something related with the economy and wealth and prosperity, things change. When it comes to these things, these domains that is related with wealth, with materialism, with the money that you own, South Koreans become become a person that they are usually not. What that means is that South Koreans are now no longer humble, but now they become, let's say, very expressive in their let's say, properties, in the things that they own, the things that they bought, their purchases, and all that. Now, in Germany, in contrast, also changes, but in a different way. So German people no longer become bold and confident as their, let's say, human quality would, let's say, be usually described as. But now it turns to something very humble. It turns to something very, let's say, very quiet, very terse and concise. People really don't prefer talking about their wealth and about something related with money. And I believe that this is a paradox. This can be considered as a social phenomenon that contradicts the normal, let's say, their usual social identities and their usual attributes as individuals and as personalities and characters. So, to explain what might cause this thing, let us dive right into the explanation section of the video. Now, talking about the South Korean aspect of the societal phenomenon, I believe that one core element of that is the collectivist culture that exists in South Korea. That means that, just in simple words, people tend to, let's say, follow the societal norms and really try hard to be a part of the virtues and of the standards set by the society, set by the greater community, basically. So instead of being individualistic and focusing on your own thing, you really try to meet the expectations of the society and meet the criteria given by the society. And also, something that comes along with this is the trait of South Korea that that really sets the benchmark and sets the standard bar way too up high. When it must be around here, they set the average standard up here, which is factually and in terms of data and statistically not correct, especially when it comes to money, prosperity, and quality of life. People think that the average is up here, but in reality, there is much more people suffering in poverty, which is the reason why the average is actually around here, around 40-50%, for example. And therefore, I really think that in order to meet these standards, in order to show that one has achieved a level of, let's say, expectation that the society needs, and in order to really show that off, because of the competition and all of the, let's say, views and perspectives out there, all of the pressure given to you, in order to express that, people tend to really talk openly and not humbly about their wealth and about the things that they buy, about their purchases, about their wages, and so on and so forth. In other words, they no longer be humble, they just flex, because that's the way to get approval by the society, and because that's the way you can attract people, by showing that you are a qualified person and that you are not poor but that you're rich. And also, I believe that secondly, something that helps this, let's say, unhumbleness grow so rapidly, and let this kind of move of individuals and of the entire community, of especially kind of young people or people in the ages where they start to earn lots of money, where they start to hit the peak of their wage and salary, is in fact technology. It's where technology, especially social media, comes into play and shapes and augments these societal phenomena, which is something negative actually. And that's because you can now share it globally, share it to your friends, to most of the people that you have in contact, and do that by simply posting a certain picture of I don't know, of a car that you bought, or a picture of you with all of your let's say mega clothes, with Gucci, I don't know, clothes and caps and bags and all that, and because of that capability and opportunity given to South Korean people, South Korean use this, let's say, platform to really push their ego and flexing to an entirely new level, an entirely new extent. And this is, of course, as I said, something negative. This is where technology really shapes cultures negatively. And that's because if people tend to show off openly in the public like that in a space called the internet, then what naturally happens is a chain reaction where people who see this person uploading and posting about his wealth and prosperity tries to mimic his actions, tries to imitate his actions by earning lots of money, and then also buying something that they think might be viewed as something really, really cool, something really, really expensive, and something that normal people can't afford. And then they post it again. And then person C comes, watches that again, and then, let's say, reflects, oh man, I really gotta also show that I'm above average and that I am capable just like him as well. And then he earns money, uses that directly to buy something or to show off, and then also post one in their Instagram. Or when it comes to just in everyday dialogues or conversations, people tend to talk openly about it, especially with their friends. Now, this really becomes a cycle of comparison and action based upon the comparison. And we know that comparison culture is not something that a culture should foster and cultivate. Of course, a good type of comparison that leads to a positive competition is good, but comparison that really is focused on jealousy, envying, and that leads you to take unsustainable and unethical or unthoughtful actions is not something that a culture must foster. But unfortunately, it is the trend that is visible, that is clearly identifiable in the South Korean community. Now, talking about the German people's action of starting as a bold and confident person to turning to a very tight-lipped and cagey person when it comes to wealth, when it comes to something related with money, when it comes to something related with property and ownership. I believe that the reason for that is mainly because of the societal and cultural trait called individualism, which contrasts with the culture that South Korea exhibits, which is the collectivist culture. And the collectivist culture is so different from the individualism that German people have because German people tend to set standards of their own. They set benchmarks of their own, and their interpretation of success is totally different of the interpretation of success of somebody else. Now, this is already visible at school age, right? It's not something that only comes when you become a 30-year-old who has to now be responsible of your own money. It's already shown in the education system as well when connecting this again to my past videos. You can see that students really don't like to compare themselves with each other, regardless of what topic they're talking about. Whether it is their capability of studying, they really think that they have their own skills and own skill sets and own abilities, and there's no necessity at all in comparing with other people about a certain topic. Also, even in sports, they don't really compare that actively and that frequently as Koreans do, by, for example, saying, I'm worse than him in soccer, I'm better than him in soccer, maybe I'm a little better than him at dribbling, maybe I'm a little worse than him in passing. Those things don't really occur as often as Korean people do in Germany. As a person who has personally played in a German soccer team and who has played different variety of sports, such including golf and stuff. And also another domains when it comes to money and ownership, based on what I've observed and what I've researched for a little older people, for people in the ages of 30s, 40s, 50s. They don't like to compare their wealth and their property with others because they also have the culture, not only the individualism, where the financial goals of person A is different than financial goal of person B, and where the standards or let's say a norm is a little unexistent. There also exists a culture where talking about money openly is kind of, let's say, rude, kind of something that does not really just basically follow the manners and the etiquettes of a conversation. So when South Korean people, if you're close enough with that person, would openly talk about their financial status and their concerns about their property and stuff, talk about stocks, talk about let's say the things that they bought, the things that they sold in the stock market recently because of the tariff and so on and so forth. German people might obviously talk about that too, but it's a little less. And that's kind of something that is very significant and vital to understand, because these are two different cultural aspects. Germany is just basically a culture that conceives and perceives that as something rude and something unmannerful, and therefore I believe that German people have this subtle switch of their trait and characteristic when it comes to talking about these related topics. So since now we have talked about the explanations and causes for this possible social phenomenon and for the paradox that we have observed, it is vital, especially as we are a culture analyzing YouTube channel of Ethan's Culture Box, it is always critical and crucial to draw a conclusion and implication. So number one conclusion is that there are different sources of influence of shaping people's and individuals' traits and characteristics of these different cultures, depending on what kind of field they're talking about. When they're talking about general lives, then the source of influence is different. When they're talking about wealth and those things, the source of influence that shape this characteristic of individuals of these countries and cultures come from a different source from the source that, let's say, created their humbleness and boldness, right? So, for example, for humbleness and personality, in general domain, it may come from the past generations, from the lessons and virtues inherited from the past generations. When it comes to wealth, the source of influence may come from jealousy, envy, and from social media, or from comparison culture and competition culture. And now talking about Germany, the German, let's say, trait of boldness can come from the education system from a young age, from their youth, and the trait and characteristics that changes when they talk about wealth might have been caused and influenced by the other aspects of culture, such as individualism, as well as the culture where these kind of topics being taught and being let's say, a material and topic of the conversation is considered rude and unmatterful. Second implication and conclusion we can draw from here is that Germany, having this paradoxical aspect of the characteristics of individuals in their culture is not something bad. It's not big of a deal. I mean, if you're good at expressing your skill sets and your capabilities in the occasions where you have to, I mean, go for it. It's an asset that German people have that is very useful and that is very admirable. Also, their way of being terse and humble when it comes to wealth and prosperity and ownership is also something that will possibly be considered as virtuous and ethical in many cultures. However, for South Korea, this paradox that they face of being humble to suddenly being very competitive, very willing to compare themselves to others, and this let's say characteristic of showing off and being overly confident and in simple words, flexing too much in the everyday lives has negative effects. It's something that must be mitigated through actions and through programs and campaigns and regulations of the government and of the social community. And that's because this may possibly affect the psychology of people and individuals living in South Korea negatively. Because, first of all, people might be depressed and might start getting more mental health issues because of the comparison and the constant pressure and perspectives given and stated from the external public. to you, directly headed towards you. Now that can basically accumulate as stress and result in a possible depression. Secondly, you may possibly have more frequent burnouts because you have to work hard to earn money that is at the standard level of expectation of the public in South Korea, of your friends, of your parents, and of your peers, and so on and so forth. And this is, of course, obviously bad for your health, because working hard without any purpose, but working hard just to be a person to get envied and to become that someone who somebody is jealous to and who somebody envies is not ethical and not healthy biologically and psychologically. Therefore, in simple terms, the goal for South Korea is to let this kind of excessive comparison and excessive show-off culture and the wealth aspects diminish. And yes, that was simply it for our video, and I hope we can talk about a certain topic that is as in-depth as this one, but that is more entertaining and more fun to watch. So, stay tuned, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye. 안녕히 계십시오. Tschüss.